Welcome to episode 83, Making Sense of the Pandemic, Psychological Impact on Clients and Communities, featuring Dr. Baruch Fischhoff by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. Today we are joined by somebody very important in today's situation, I guess, and what's happening in the world. Today we're going to be talking about the coronavirus pandemic and specifically pandemics and how the community at large responds to them psychologically and how we can both support the health of ourselves and of our clients in responding to this changing environment. Today we have Dr. Baruch Fischhoff with us, and he is a university professor at Carnegie Mellon. He has a number of specializations in public health and in the area of pandemics. Thank you so much for joining us, Baruch. We are honored to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to have such a unique and now pertinent specialization?
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. So I grew up in Detroit. I did a degree in math and at Wayne State University, and then my wife and I moved to Israel, thinking that we were going to live on a kibbutz for the rest of our life, and she, being the sensible one in our family, decided it wasn't a great idea. So we moved to Jerusalem, and I had the unusual or kind of remarkable opportunity to study with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who were my dissertation advisors. Some people may know Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And then we moved to Eugene, Oregon. We lived for 13 years, where I worked with Paul Slovic and Sarah Lichtenstein, just as the field of judgment and decision-making was taking off. And most people in the field ended up in business schools, and Paul, Sarah, and I ended up working on public sector problems. And then I've been at Carnegie Mellon for 30-some years, and I'm like to work at the intersection where we have to understand the science of a problem before understanding the people who, in order to understand the reality that people are facing when they need to make decisions about it. So I've had the opportunity to work on a very wide variety of problems: health, safety, environment, nuclear power, sexual assault, breast cancer. And in the pandemic area, I've been part of research on SARS, H5N1 or avian flu, and Ebola. And in all of these situations, in some sense, we're the same people facing these varied decisions. We build up some knowledge about each specific area, but in the end, we're the same people trying to live our lives. So, anyways, I've been working on a large variety of these things. I've I guess had some professional success. I'm a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine, although I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm happy to be able to help here. This is the public supports our work. If this is a chance to give back, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you so much. So you have a doctorate in psychology and a very unique perspective then coming at this, as you said, kind of the intersection, the confluence of these different ideas. Why don't you start by telling us, number one, what is a pandemic? And how did we get here, as we're talking about specifically coronavirus, but pandemics in general?
Well, there's an official definition of pandemics that is held by various bureaucratic organizations and have their own somewhat obscure and somewhat changing rules for deciding when to call something a pandemic. It's actually one of those places where the official communications end up confusing people. And or recently we've had emergency declarations by different states, and you would think that this is a great cause for alarm, but I think in all cases it has just been a bureaucratic decision that releases funds that wouldn't be available otherwise. And you wouldn't know that unless you read the small print of their press release. In simpler terms, pandemic is a disease that's getting out of control and is spreading through the population.
And when we're thinking of a pandemic, of course, all of us are, as you said, experiencing this ourselves and then also watching it in our immediate communities in different states and looking at different countries. And we in the United States were watching what was happening across various oceans and then wondering when it was going to get here. What's some of the background surrounding the psychology of pandemics, if you will? Like, how do people respond to this kind of unusual state of living?
Yeah. Well, we haven't ever had anything like this in the lifetime of people alive today, unless they've been they've been exposed to Ebola or happen to be near the epicenter of the swine flu pandemic. So most people haven't had this kind of experience in terms of being directly threatened or being told that it's coming your way. So it's sometimes viscerally a different experience than we've had before, and intellectually, it's something that, in some ways, it's like any new problem that shows up, and people need to, try to make sense out of it. And when they try to make sense out of it, they can turn to some authorities to try to get a clear picture. And in this case, that's been missing. If you look to political leaders, we've had conflicting opinions, or you can turn to the news media, which I think have provided a vital role here in trying to figure out what's on people's minds, how to get it to them in terms that they can understand. And I think that's actually typically been the case in various crises, that these sort of crises are predictable. That is, we've had, pandemics or almost pandemics that I've mentioned before. And each time there's a call for better preparation of our health services and our mental health services. Each time there's a call for prepared communication, so we get tested messages out to people. And over the last 20 years in the United States, we've had less and less preparation. We've had fewer and fewer resources that have gone to the public health system. So we end up being, I think, inappropriately caught flat-footed. And I think that part of what people are sensing is that we as a society, for whatever political or economic or bureaucratic reasons, are not as prepared as we should be, in ways that have left everybody vulnerable.
I think you hit on an important point there, which is the struggles with infrastructure, that at the point that something happens, then there's this sense of panic and chaos because we're not confident in the systems as they exist. I know even in my area, it's like, well, which school is closing? And, when is it going to happen next? A kind of this domino effect instead of a unified response that would have been instituted had there been more infrastructure. When we're looking to get advice as consumers and as professionals about what's going on, who do we listen to? Who do we believe? What resources do you feel, based on your experience and your education, are the most reliable?
If somebody asks me, I recommend, find a very small number of responsible print media. People will know which ones they trust. Your local health department, which has all the information from the national health department, from the national sources, can tailor it to the local environment, and is probably less subject to political forces, and I would recommend not watching very much TV, or only watching TV in order to see what it tells you about the players. That in terms of information about a pandemic, it doesn't change very quickly. Like if you checked your print sources a few times, once a day, you'd probably know about all you needed to know. I have colleagues at Roxanne Cohen-Silver, Allison Holman, Dana Garfin, and at UC Irvine, who have been studying the effects of how people respond to stressful events, and have found that two of the best predictors, or the two best predictors, are how vulnerable they are in their own lives, either just where they are in their lives or what previous stresses they have had in general. And the second best predictor is how much TV they watch. And their explanation is that the expertise of people in TV, that how they make their living, is in grabbing our emotions and keeping us through the next commercial break. And having those informations being played for an extended period of time takes a toll. Sometimes you see images or hear things that are difficult to forget, don't do you any good, and you just as soon have not heard them. And then TV is occasionally has some, very good explanations, and they do have some gifted communicators on technical information, but it's a very slow way of gathering information. If you can read a little, that's good. So that's what I would do in terms of getting information, and I would shut off social media as a source of information, but stay in social media in terms of, seeing how people are feeling, helping them to cope with this, but not to believe anything that hasn't somehow been vetted by a scientific source.
Thank you. I really appreciate that guidance and the idea that these things don't move that quickly. And certainly I've seen in the community people voraciously consuming information that by and large doesn't change that fast. And so there's this inundation with data and information coming at us that can seem all consuming. I think what you brought up about not just the vulnerability, but how much TV somebody is watching is a really good point. And for us as practitioners to even ask clients that, how much are you reading about this, and how are the other parts of your life progressing outside of the pandemic? When it comes to consuming this information, for those people who are particularly vulnerable right now and are watching more TV, what are some common responses that they might experience in terms of their feelings and their behaviors?
I mean, one of the things in our lives, we're accustomed to making decisions under conditions of uncertainty and to taking risks, because that's just part of life, but we would rather not. So there is a desire to find some certainty both about the world and some certainty about ourselves. What trade-offs do we really want to make? And at some point in probing the world and probing yourselves, you reach a point of diminishing returns. That is, you're not making any progress. You're just going around in circles. And at that point, if you can, it's worth saying, well, I've gotten as far as I'm going to get, and I'm going to make some kind of decision, and I'm going to accept the reality that I maybe be surprised by the world. Things may go in unexpected ways, and I may be surprised by myself. That is, I may respond to things in ways that I didn't. That is, I may, discover that I'm braver than I thought, or I may discover that I've gotten myself into something that I thought I could handle, but is really beyond me. One of the things, there are two judgmental biases that or decision-making biases that people in our field have studied. So one is called outcome bias, and it entails judging the quality of a decision by how it turns out rather than by the quality of the thinking that went into it. So if you've done the best you could and things turn badly, don't add the insult of regret to the injury of whatever happened. Sometimes good decisions, you meet bad luck. Sometimes the best decision is actually making the best of a bad situation. So, kind of be kinder to yourself if you've done everything you could. And the second one is hindsight bias, which is that once something has happened, it's easy to exaggerate how predictable it was. And you think, oh, I should have known that had I gone there, there would be somebody who was shedding virus, in which, that person was there unexpectedly. And you had done your due diligence about anticipating the situation, and it somehow turned out differently. So, if you can sort of remember where you were and what you did when you made the decision, that you can protect yourself against being too hard on yourself.
I appreciate that feedback. I've seen what I would consider a struggle with control, of how out of control pretty much all of us feel, of not knowing if and when we might get it, how it's going to affect us. Of course, there's been huge economic impact that's going to be longstanding, and that I would imagine then some of the things we're seeing in society, in communities where we're standing in line for hours to buy excessive amounts of toilet paper, for example, that's one of our ways, I would assume, then, of trying to get control when things feel out of control.
Arguably, the right emotion is anger at the people who've put you in this situation. That is, why are we as a country so unprepared now? And unprepared both in the short terms, and this is the middle of March when we're recording this. We had 2 months, even longer, to prepare for this, and the country is unprepared now. And in a longer sense, a longer time frame, our country has been unprepared for this kind of event, which everybody, all the scientists, all the public officials knew that this was going to happen. We were lucky that SARS and avian flu and swine flu and Ebola were either the virus was kind to us, and it turned out to be more controllable, and to some extent, and we had really valiant public health officials and healthcare people who were able to get on top of it with hard work and personal risk. So it's no surprise that this has happened, and yet we've had a steady decline in our investment in public health. And we've also had a steady decline in our investment in the social capabilities of providing for people who are more vulnerable. So, this country, there are an awful lot of kids who get their primary nutrition at school. And I see, really, valiant, dedicated people improvising ways of getting food to those kids now. And we have a lot of people. We have people who are vulnerable in various ways. We arguably don't do well by them under normal circumstances, and we don't have the infrastructure for reaching out to them. So there are a lot of volunteer things in efforts going on, and those are really laudable. It's not quite the same as having built-in services for providing for people.
You bring up a good point, which is the varying impact of something like this on different groups of people, and how that affects those who are not as privileged in socioeconomic status, or have vulnerabilities when it comes to a medical condition, or by age. What do the the lesser affected, if you will, the less vulnerable people do to support the greater good when we have, particularly for coronavirus, for COVID-19, for example, older people that tend to be more vulnerable and individuals with some kind of immunosuppression. How do the rest of us help protect everybody?
Part of the current program in the United States and other countries is for people to, in a sense, withdraw from social interactions, either to protect themselves, but in more cases, actually, to some extent, really just to protect others, because there are people, according to the best current evidence, most people who get the virus will have relatively mild effects, but they during the time that they're potentially shedding, they're a risk to everybody else. So, in some sense, we're protecting ourselves, but also absorbing a social responsibility for protecting others. So following those guidelines, even though I think they're unintuitive to many people, that it's unintuitive how a pandemic can grow exponentially. I mean, there's been research for many years showing that we're just not very good at intuitively running the numbers on exponential processes. So if somebody has run the numbers for you and it's been through peer review and they're properly diplomat, I would trust their numbers. And at the time that we're talking, it's still not clear how transmissible people who are asymptomatic in the incubation period, or people who are actually sick but are asymptomatic, how much of a threat they are to other people. So it's just, you feel pretty good, you may be a threat to other people. So I think following the public health advice is something that each of us can do. Beyond that, there are in every community organizations that know how to, who know where the people with challenges are, who provide them services. Some of those are they're nonprofits, they're faith-based organizations, there's neighborhood groups, and I would say reach out to them. They will have an idea about what kind of services are needed. And some of those services can be provided by people who really don't want to leave their house, but maybe they need financial services. Maybe people just need a phone call. Somebody who's in a nursing home and able to hear, has hearing is good enough that they can take a phone call, don't have relatives nearby, and maybe they just need a phone call. So I think talking to the people who know those communities will give people an opportunity to help others, which I think the research shows that usually makes us feel better about this. And there's some chance that as a community, as a society, we will come out the better for this period.
The idea of giving back, I think, certainly, I know I've seen the research too, can increase our feelings of interconnectedness and our feelings of security. Tell me more about the idea of panic. Because I've heard, if you're watching TV, if you're listening to the radio, then you're hearing so many different perspectives on this. As you mentioned earlier, it's like some people are saying, oh, this is unnecessary panic, and some are saying, no, we need to be terrified. How do you sort through that from an emotional and psychological perspective? Like, what is panic? Where is it coming from? And what are the pros and cons in this particular situation?
Well, so panic is one of those vague terms that it's a sort of vague term that leads social scientists to invent jargon. so it's distinguish what we're talking about from this vague term. And one way to think about it is so one of the meaning is just feeling panicky. And, there's some people, again, as clinical psychologists who know for whom this is really an intense part of their life, and they try to help them. Most of us feel panicky at one moment, or another, and it usually doesn't lead anywhere. We get through the situation, or worst comes to worst, and then we deal with the consequences. So that's feeling panicky. It's it's just part of life. I think that the kind of panic that some people have in mind is people losing their sort of losing their grip, and abandoning other people, violating social norms, and that this is something that sociologists study because it's a group phenomenon rather than an individual phenomenon. It just turns out to be very rare. I have a colleague, Kathleen Tierney at the University of Colorado, who argues that there are probably literally more panics over any period of time in the movies than there are in the world. And one of the examples, first meeting I went to after 9/11 was the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. I met somebody there who was an expert in egress, that is how people get out of buildings. And he said that the preliminary calculations were that the egress from the World Trade Center had exceeded the theoretical limits. And the way they modeled egress is as a fluid dynamic process. That is, they view people as a fluid flowing through a confined space. How quickly people flow depends on how viscous they are, in a sense, how smoothly they go through. And in maybe I'm pushing this metaphor a little far, but in his interpretation, that people under those extreme circumstances, people were unusually helpful for one another, and more people got out of the building than was theoretically expected, despite some of them helping disabled people along the first responders climbing to their death. And then after that, we have people have the image of people running in the streets below in order to get away. And again, that was a very organized, heroic under the circumstances evacuation that again saved many lives of the people who had gotten out of the out of the area. So as Kathleen, the sociologists, find that panic is very rare, and there's actually a literature in sociology on what they call the myth of panic. So she said, well, where does this belief in panic come from? So some of it is from a kind of a casual analysis of human behavior. So you see people running in the streets and you say, wow, they look panicky. And then if you sort of thought about it a little bit more, you would say, no, actually they're doing just what they should be doing, getting out as quickly as they can, helping one another, not stepping on one another, and then the sociologists, some of them argue that actually the myth of panic, so that's a cognitive reason for believing in it. It looks appearances are deceiving. The second one is that this is a useful myth for people who would like to control the public. So you say, people will panic. They really need our strong hand to guide them.
The idea of the myth of panic, it sounds like really what you're summing up is the fact that panic is not actually necessarily a bad thing, that that we could interpret it to be negative in different ways. And if we're interpreting it as a mechanism of control, for example, but in the example of the World Trade Centers, it was actually this pretty prudent and helpful response by one human being to the next that produced better outcomes. And as I apply this to what's happening right now with COVID-19, we see people that really are very, very low risk that are quote unquote panicking, whatever that term means. And so they're stockpiling different things and hoarding bottles of water. But I can also see that the benefit of that quote unquote panic may be that they are then following other recommendations like social distancing that's going to create more safety for others.
I mean, at the time that we're talking, hoarding of toilet paper is a popular topic, and like any human behavior, there are a lot of things going on, and it means different things for different people. I think the way that I don't know, decision scientists or risk analysts might look at it would be to say, coronavirus was not a big deal, and all of a sudden it's become a big deal, and people are told you should be prepared for, being locked in your homes for 2 weeks or 4 months or whatever, and you have a responsibility for having stocks to stock up, and you go to the store and they don't have the food that you like. There's some other food that you can get, but there are no substitutes for toilet paper. And so everybody wants that. And because of the failure of planning in this country, the supply chain for toilet paper is, the stores are not ready for that demand. So one could have one knew 2 months ago that this was likely enough to happen, that you could have asked the toilet paper industry to ramp up production, to store things. It's expensive storage because it's very bulky, but they have as I understand it, the toilet paper industry, most of it is made in the United States. They have relatively limited surge capacity, but they probably could have been in a position that they could have made the present surge. So that was a failure of planning. And then there's also, I would say, a failure of communication. Imagine that, I don't know what the facts are here, but imagine that, 2 or 3 weeks we'll have enough toilet paper. And if that is the case, or 1 week, or whatever it is, why isn't somebody telling the public that so that they can know how to plan? And I think that the sense of insecurity that people have is fostered by the lack of planning in the country, the lack of clear messages, the lack of communications that address people's basic concerns, all of which, they're predictable. Sometimes there are very few surprises here in terms of what we needed to do to plan, our resources, our communications, and we haven't done it.
When you mention communications, tell us more about that. Tell us about kind of the pandemic effect on basic human communication and also on relationships. But how do we work with the fact that we are getting mixed messages? You mentioned some positive and reliable resources, but from kind of a psychological perspective, how do we make sense of that?
Well, it will be interesting in the future for somebody to reconstruct how it is that some people were more prepared than others. Had everybody been as unprepared at this time, we would have been in much worse shape. And my reading is that one signal came from, I think, technologically savvy organizations or firms or scientific institutions that had begun planning, that had seen the signal and had begun planning for their own purposes. And at some point, people who were associated with, name your leading tech firm, all of whom started to shut things down and made contingency plans quite a long time ago. I know that my university, Carnegie Mellon, started planning in January, thinking that it had a responsibility to our community to make plans, and if only as an insurance policy, to make plans and seeing where this developed. We have a community. They knew about it. There were good communications from our our management, and that got out to some set of people. And I suspect that we're as prepared as we are has been this informal mobilization by saying, well, here's somebody who's not trying to spin anything. They're not trying to sell anything. They're just working the problem for people like myself. I guess they know something. I'm going to stick with them. I would give my university credit, and I'm sure this is true other places, that from the very beginning, they have had very inclusive messages. So we have a fair number of foreign students, particularly from China. It was apparent early on, and early as January, that some of them were experiencing ethnic discrimination, and so all of the communications had, expressions of solidarity, that the institution was committed to all of the members of its community, which I think valuable to the people who were being included, and gave other people language, and a frame of reference that they could carry on in their lives. And then there's kind of informal dissemination for how people thought about this situation.
In terms of the dissemination of information and then the reaction to it, one of the things that I've seen that's been interesting, and so, as you're stating, kind of a lack of cohesive direction from the powers that be. So it's kind of reminded me of Who's on First, or the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, going both directions at once. And this conflict that I assume has contributed to the chaos, to the sense of panic, if you will, to use that word again, but the sense of discontent and, oh my goodness, what are we going to do about it? So now that we're here, that it has descended upon us, so to speak, and now it's spreading. What do we do as individuals and as communities to respond to this in a way that's prudent and effective?
Yeah. Well, one perspective I think it will be helpful for some people is to think of this as a limited period. It may be 3 months, it may be 6 months. Our society will emerge on the other side of this, and each of us will look at our own behavior and hope that we had responded appropriately, and we will look at other people's behavior and see how they have responded. And also that we're doing things now, unusual things now, for a limited period. We're being asked now not to touch our faces. So you couldn't touch your face for the rest of your life, but you could for 15 minutes between going to the store and coming home. Seeing your family by FaceTime rather than in purpose. It would be a real change in your life if that was the rest of your life, but this is a period. So I think that's a useful perspective. A second is I've seen people, I've talked to people who have taken this as an opportunity for creative solutions. That is to say, well, how can I make this an interesting period? So I was talking to my son-in-law, who's a professor of computer engineering, and was teaching a makerspace class this term. And that's getting people together, looking at designing computer chips and so on. It's very intimate activity. You couldn't really do that, even if his university was still open. And that class is pivoting to doing, well, imagine we had this product. How would we do the marketing? How would we do the user testing? How would we... so we'll do something, we'll do something else within this. Or people are trying to figure out how to organize courses that are online and, test out this new technology. We've got 6 or 8 weeks of the term. So we're, treating this as a, kind of a unique experience. I think that people often, when we have a decision, we say, well, we look at this decision as having 2 fixed alternatives. Like, do I go to the gym or not? in each of these situations, you could think about, well, is there some creative way of changing the terms of this decision so that I can make it, I can make it self-enhancing and just a part of this general experience. So being creative that way, redefining what our typical alternatives might be something that people can do in some of these situations.
I can hear what you're saying in a few different therapy methods. So, one of them is narrative psychology and the idea of being mindful of the words we're using to describe the phenomenon. I read a news story just the other day that used the term indefinite when describing the changes to the American way of living. And it was just such a strong and brusque term. And in my mind, I remember counteracting it and kind of going, well, temporary, like, yes, this is going to have a long standing impact. But in terms of our day to day living, this is, I hope, a temporary situation that is going to go back to some relative sense of normalcy. So I can hear kind of the narrative benefit in what you're saying. And also to view it, I like that idea of a unique experience. Basically, well, at least I'm going to get a good story out of this, and obviously that's not for the people that have been profoundly affected and are very, very ill, and have such poor outcomes. But for those of us, the majority of us who are healthy and are going to come out of this healthy, to be very mindful, I think, to kind of interpret what you're saying, be mindful of the black and white thinking and not make it forever. We'll live in this pandemic based world forever, but that this is something that has some kind of time limited component to it.
But I think that makes a lot of sense. So we're all looking to one another to figure out what to do, but also what does all this mean? And if you've got a good idea or a good way to think about it, a good set of terms, I think that's people will obviously find meaning in different ways, but these kind of discussions about mutually supportive ways of doing it. I think sharing things that people find useful, places where they've been able to help, people that are particularly vulnerable, what they've really never had the time before. They have a little more time now, never really thought about it that much. Thought that, well, there's organizations or agencies that deal with it, but maybe let's see what I can do this time. Brings them in contact with other parts of the community that they might not have known. And for the worrying, you reach that point of diminishing returns fairly soon. So you might as well, fill up that time, try to fill up that time with something else. If you're older, great time to organize those family photos, create albums that you can share with other people, or whatever. Each of us will find, could be looking for things like that.
I like that you're giving us some practical suggestions, because when I'm thinking of this and talking with clients about it, that idea that while they're experiencing this phenomenon, we are also experiencing it simultaneously. And so we're sharing this human experience. And you're giving us some practical ideas, like here are some things that people can do. So not only how do we approach it um, as providers, as clinicians, but how do we support clients in limiting their consumption of news and of television that's related to any pandemic, but in this case, specifically talking about COVID-19. How do we work with them in therapy? So addressing the black and white thinking, trying to work on a temporary basis instead of a permanent basis. I think these are really practical concepts that are helpful, I know, for me, and helpful for our listeners, because so many of us feel kind of powerless. It just feels like this wave that we've gotten hit with. And while we're on that topic, kind of a powerlessness, what are the typical psychological responses to something like this? Like, how long do we stay in, oh my God, zone? And how long does it take us? Or just what are the general stages of responding to such a big life change that is likely temporary, but nonetheless?
So I'm a cognitive psychologist. So what we think about is how do people understand things? And one term that we think about, one way that we organize some parts of the research are um, what are people's mental models of what's going on? And I suspect that in some places, you all do something similar. So, for example, the example I gave earlier of how TV works on you. So the results that my colleagues found, they had a good psychological explanation. They're flooding your channels, working your emotions, not giving you very much information. That would help to explain why the experience works and might strengthen your resolve to resist that temptation. Or another thing that we know from the research is that people are very good at making sense of anything that they hear. So you hear a crazy, conspiracy theory from a source you completely don't trust, and you think, well, you start to figure out how that might be true. And you may be resolved not to follow that line of thought, but then once it's in your mind, it may be churning there, and you'll find, you hear a scrap of evidence, you say, I heard a theory that fits with, just because that's the way the mind naturally works in terms of its sense-making properties. You really owe it to yourself not to listen, because you just can't shut it out once it's started. Something else is that that people gradually figure things out. Part of it is through observation. Part of it is that the news media or the therapists or their friends, somehow the better information filters to most people. So we did a survey of a nationally representative group towards the end of Ebola, and we found that so Ebola had some of the same properties of coronavirus in terms of the risk management. It was, it was underrated. There were people who denied its reality. The first couple of cases were badly handled. The people who talked about them, wasn't clear that they were leveling with the audience, so there's a strong element of distrust that got into the system. But within a moderate period of time, people had figured it out well enough that we tend to ask people to give us very precise answers to questions, like what is the probability that if you spent a day in the office with somebody who had Ebola but was asymptomatic that you would catch it? Because the answers like that we're able to compare with the best statistical estimates and see how accurate people are. And we can also compare answers to related questions in order to see whether people have internally consistent beliefs and can use the numbers that we want to get from them. So that's part of our expertise. And we found that, by the time we, sort of 2 months into it, people gave us very, consistent estimates, mostly defensible. We even asked people, it's probably a number that maybe your listeners will have heard. We asked them for R naught, which is the basic reproductive number. So it's like, for every person who gets a disease, how many people will get it from them? And so if it's less than 1, then the disease is vanishing. If it's more than 1, then it grows at an exponential rate. And people gave to this very unusual question, which was not in the news media at all. It's much more in the news media now. People gave us very realistic answers. So people will begin to figure it out. They'll get some feeling for what the magnitudes are. They'll have a mental model that figures out. They'll have more of a feeling of cognitive control. They'll know have some feeling about who to trust and who not to trust. And so they'll find patterns that will become new habits. So people will adapt. Not everybody, again, as you all know, there's some people who are particularly vulnerable, and that their lives, psychologically are in turmoil, and other people whose lives in, just the day-to-day living, making ends meet, getting food on the table, feeding their kids, whose lives will be disrupted, and we owe it to them to help them. But people will sort of figure out what's going on, and it may be something that they can't cope with.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. I think that is very interesting and important information for us to have, particularly as mental health professionals. This idea that people are in, panic mode, if you will. They're panicky about what's happening. But you're saying, based on the research, by and large, people are going to figure it out. They're going to adjust to a new normal. They're going to figure out how this is actually working, how it's affecting them, who they can listen to, who they can't, and they will respond. And when I'm thinking about even like the crisis models of mental health treatment, when we're looking at kind of the timeline of how long it takes us to respond to a major life change, whether it's stress or eustress, that we're looking at usually anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. And it sounds like in your survey that you were doing, you were looking at the 2-month mark. So I can hear the kind of overlap that's happening there. So when it comes to the practical side, not just the practical part of therapy and counseling with individuals, and obviously working with ourselves on our own fears about what's happening, what are practical steps we can take and encourage in our clients to keep ourselves safe and to keep others safe and healthy?
Well, I think sort of going through the things that we've talked about, I say limiting yourself to a small number of trustworthy print sources for information, and being very disciplined about ignoring the rest, unless you want to find out who those people are. But even so, I would be disciplined. That will avoid you being misled. It'll reduce the chances of people working your emotions, and will also give you a feeling that, you really done all you could in trying to figure this out. And some limited time each day you'll devote to checking in on the virus, and the rest of the time you'll try to figure out how to find meaning for yourself in this period, how to help others, how to reach out for help. Recognizing that everybody else is under stress, including your therapist, and we're in this together. And then I think again, as I said earlier, I think we will all be judging ourselves and one another in terms of how well we did in this situation, given our material and psychological resources.
When it comes to not just the emotional side of things, just to reiterate for our listeners, for the folks who may not have consumed as much news as some of us have, what are the things that we need to be doing physically? So, I mean, I know sitting in my office right now, we've installed hand sanitizer stations. I know we had a conversation even today in my suite about whether or not we were going to see clients in person or we're going to see folks through video and teletherapy. What are some of those really practical behavior choices that we as human beings can be making and also encouraging in our clients?
It's a small number of things that you can find in many different places. The tricky thing is to figure out how you take these general principles and fit them into ambiguous situations. Like, your presence is important to your clients, and you're important to your clients' presence. There probably is research on, telehealth, telemedicine, on how well that works. It would be interesting to know what that is. If it turns out that you have some clients whom they really need that, then I think the kind of creative problem solving that you had, that you were discussing, or consulting with a number of people who will see different perspectives, might have creative solutions. That's probably the best way to go about it, because the people who offer the general advice uh, they don't know everybody's reality. So we're all limited in the perspectives that we can take. So consulting with people in related situations, might help you to either to figure out what to do or to figure out how to frame it, how to think about it in a way that it felt not exactly the way you want to do it, but there's a constructive way to think about it.
I think you bring up something really important there, which is how do we interpret this information then and actually apply it? And it sounds like you're reaching more for kind of a social model, which is, if you're having trouble interpreting it, then reach out to your peers and get feedback. I've certainly seen quite a bit of that in our field on social media of people reaching out to one another and saying, hey, here's what we're doing in our office. What are you doing? And then at the end of the day, going back to one of your earlier points, we can't necessarily, we can't gauge our response based on the outcome. We can only gauge it based on the information that we use to make a decision. Because I think all of us, I think there's this kind of phenomenon of paralysis right now of like, well, what do I do? Do I go to the grocery store? Do I tell my clients that I'm only going to see them online? And which clients? Is it just the ones that have an issue with their immune system or are older, and how do we make these decisions? I think there certainly is this desire to get all of that information from someone, where I almost feel like a school child wanting to look at a teacher that's going to say, okay, now do this. And it's like, okay, good. Now I know the right answer. Because it's this time of uncertainty that we're not particularly well equipped with contending with right now. And I like your suggestion, which is reach out to other people and seek feedback.
Yeah, so I would go back to something we were talking about earlier. So, if you've got the best information that you can, individually and collectively, you've been as creative as you can about having solutions. You make a decision figuring that you've done the best you can, and then try to be easier on yourself and move on to other things. And then maybe have a little bit of anger at the people who left you in this situation. I mean, who are the people who, did not plan for this situation? Who are the people who didn't answer your questions even though they could have? Like, what is the supply chain for toilet paper?
You also bring up then the importance of a pretty fundamental therapy component, which is simply normalizing feelings. That people are going to go through a series of different emotions in response to this. One of them potentially being anger of how did we find ourselves in the situation? And for us as mental health professionals to provide, I think, containment and normalization of that experience, not necessarily try to combat it with data or anything else, but to go back to our basics, which is meeting people where they're at.
Yeah. So is it okay to be angry if you've been wronged?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Indeed it is. And I also think it's okay to be scared. And I'm even thinking of different people in my life and different responses to it. I had a friend reach out to me and say, hey, how are you responding to this? And I, for one, have a background in working in crisis management in the Red Cross. And so for me, I'm actually used to this. I'm quite calm. But it's interesting to consider just how different personalities are playing out. And I think that's one of the concerns as mental health professionals. How do we respond to different personality types with our clients when we're looking at a specific population that has obvious vulnerability? More than likely, if they're in therapy, if they're in treatment, they have a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder. They may also have certain personality traits that make them particularly vulnerable, like a sensory processing sensitivity. So I think taking all of those things into consideration, I appreciate what you're saying, which is kind of go back to basics and be with each other as human beings and start there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in Pittsburgh. We follow Fred Rogers here. Look for the helpers, and I guess be one of the helpers.
Thank you, Baruch. I really appreciate everything that you've said today. I could certainly keep talking with you on this topic. So for people that are listening, what are some resources that you recommend for them? How can they get in touch with you if they'd like to? I'm sure you're quite a hot commodity right now, and thank you for your time with us. But please give us resources and how to be in touch with you.
You have my name. I'm at Carnegie Mellon. If you look at my website, there's a bunch of publications. Some are technical, some are less technical. If you wanted to read something about our science, we have a little book called Risk, a very short introduction that pretty much covers the science. It's from this wonderful series that Oxford has of very short introductions, and it's inexpensive. They're written for a general audience. It'll give you an introduction to our science, and I make very little from it, so I'm not in it for the money. And and I wish everybody the best. My wife works in social services and is much more. I think of her as our delegate to the real world, and is in touch with lots of people doing very creative, humane things in the Pittsburgh area, and I'm confident that this is happening all around the country. So all power to those people who are doing that.
Thank you, Baruch. So the best way to reach you then just be look you up at Carnegie Mellon. Thank you so much for your time, for the expertise that you've shared with us. As I said, I think you've given us some really practical takeaways that I know for me are very helpful, and I'm sure are for our listeners. So thank you again for taking time out to talk with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. And, and you all are really very important in this situation. So I'm glad if I helped you with your work.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.